All around the world, military modelers strive to achieve ever higher standards in accuracy, realism and detail. From their own workshops, in this series, our expert model craftsmen share their award-winning techniques so that you may benefit from their vast experience. Rob Hendon is recognized throughout the modeling world as a master at painting and finishing military figures. For more than 25 years, he's produced a vast body of work. This encompasses many award-winning models and numerous inspirational articles for the modeling press. In this program, Rod takes us through all the stages of the creation of his gold medal winning Fallschirmjäger, including construction and detailing, priming, pre-shading, painting and finishing. So, now it's time to join Rob at his workbench.
The choice of military models has grown over the last few years, and there's an absolute plethora of various figures that are available on the market today. Really, it's just down to your own personal choice what type of models you'd like to actually produce. Many people will be familiar with 1/72nd, sometimes referred to as HO00 scale, which was very popular, particularly our childhoods. We can hark back to times when we made possibly airfix and Revell kits of tanks and vehicles of this scale. They're a good starting point for learning how to paint figures, but more recently the scales have got bigger and bigger. The most popular scale is 1/32nd scale or 54mm scale, as seen on this Latorre figure for Roman cavalry general. There are absolutely amazing amount of 54mm scale figures, and it's a very popular scale to work in. This leads us up to the model which we'll be preparing and painting. It's a resin 1/9 scale figure, so there's plenty of work to do here. Right, well, we've got some quite large, noticeable, recognisable components. This is fairly typical of a resin figure. Nice pieces, but I don't think the SS Fallschirmjäger probably wore ice skates, so that need to be removed, as well as other pieces such as the helmet and various grenades and pouches, etc., which have excess material. It can be quite a difficult thing to remove, but I'll show you sort of how to do that, and it shouldn't be too much of a problem. The worst problems are large excess moulding plugs, which need to be removed with a razor saw, or quicker but quite a dangerous way of doing it, a razor saw attachment on a mini drill. And there you go. It's come off quite cleanly there. Most of the material came off in that large moulding plug, but there is still a little bit of excess material which really needs to be smoothed out so that the helmet fits on correctly when we assemble it. This is going to be done in a couple of ways. I can use the scalpel, which will get it even, but also you could actually just put wet or dry paste on a flat surface. As you can see, that's pretty much got that level. As we're only relying on the strength of the glue, which will be the cyanoacrylate superglue, to hold pieces together, it's often a good idea to drill and pin certain parts of the figure. I'll just demonstrate drilling and pinning of the head to the torso. You'll require a piece of anything like welding rod or old wire coat hangers, which can easily just be snipped off in small sections and used. We've got a piece of wire here. Basically, make sure you've got a drill that's the same sort of diameter, and first of all drill a hole in the torso. Just check to see that the rod fits in there. It fits quite nicely. Now it's not always easy to locate the dead centre to mate up parts such as the neck and the shoulders to line these up. So really a good idea is just have a good look and study and approximate where the hole should be drilled on the head. So it looks like it's almost dead centre in there. You can actually bend the pin if necessary, but if all else fails, another pin can be drilled off centre to locate it. It's just really purely for strengthening. There's absolutely no problem with the cosmetic look of this. So I'll drill a hole in the neck. There it is. Now even without any glue, that is quite a nice snug fit. Any of the main pieces, such as the arms, the torso to the leg section and the feet to the legs, benefit from drilling and pinning. Quite often it's good to put hands on the end of wrists with small pins. It makes for a good strong figure. The other points of attachment, such as the arms, I shall probably rely on their existing moulded location points, which are very accurate. We've got to the stage now where we'll prime the components of the figure. The primer that I generally choose to use is just an ordinary automotive car spray acrylic grey primer. The grey primer is a great base for the equipment and uniform, etc. Sometimes a white primer would be better for heads and hands, that type of thing, but it's a light grey, so it's quite a neutral shade. It's generally quite good and acceptable for most applications. Now I've turned the helmet upside down because obviously it's difficult to get the underneath covered very well. So I'll give that just a fine dust coat to begin with. Everything will just get a very fine dust coat. Holding this, I'm just going to spray from under the chin to get a good start on it. Don't be put off that it looks very wet at this stage, because it has got a tendency to look alarmingly sort of wet and thick, but it's actually not too bad at all. And if you just help the drying with a hairdryer, it's beginning to shrink back and it looks quite respectable. Now it's important to note that sometimes it's difficult to get paint into areas like the ears because of undercuts, and the aerosol can can't necessarily get into there. So you have to be persistent and build up coats. So we'll just be mindful that the inside of the helmet, it's important to spray that as well, because that will need to be painted inside as well as out. You don't want lack of paint anywhere really. Now the thing is to keep an eye on what areas have been covered and just try to build up coat. And it may look like you're putting a lot of paint on at this stage, but it does actually shrink back. When the spirit evaporates, there's not that much actual paint on there. By the time that's got a couple of coats of primer on, making sure not to obscure the rivet detail, that should look quite nice. There shouldn't be any problems at all. Everything's getting a quite consistent finish now, which is good. So once everything is primed to this stage, all there is really is to assemble the complete figure ready for painting. So we've got to this stage, and now comes for me the most exciting part, is actually starting to paint, getting some colour on him and hopefully bringing the figure to life. And the important thing is to get everything together and put all the other pieces in a safe place out of harm's way until they're required. It's a good idea just to get them away from the area totally in case anything's lost or damaged. For many years, modellers have used the old standby, which has always been enamel paints. For many years I've used these and to great effect, but in recent years I've turned to the use of Vallejo acrylics and also life colour acrylics, but there are still various uses for other makes and brands of paint for specialist effects. So I have quite a selection of paints for different jobs. For the purpose of this figure, I've chosen to use a mixture of the Model Air range from Vallejo and life colour, which are made in Italy. It's a common misconception that either a brush or an airbrush is used when painting a figure. I find that the combination of both the airbrush and brushwork gives exactly what you want. The airbrush really is great for improving textures and giving nice graduated tonal effects. But where the airbrush work finishes and the brush work begins is really the nitty-gritty of getting the best out of a figure. When brush painting, a large selection of varying sizes of brush are required for all sorts of different jobs. I generally like to keep some nice fine points, such as this 5.0, which is extremely fine. That's great for painting very fine details such as eyes. A useful size to have is something like a number 2 brush, which can hold a reasonable amount of paint. This is ideal for painting reasonably large areas, or comparatively large areas. So once those base colours are applied, something like a 00 or like this 3.0 are ideal for things such as eyes and very, very fine details. Sable brushes, if they're looked after, can be used for quite a few years, but the smaller ones tend to wear out quite easily. Also, I tend not to throw away older brushes. These can always come in handy for a technique known as dry brushing, which is a great technique for enhancing and highlighting fine moulded detail. I have an absolutely disgusting looking brush here, which has got super glue and all sorts of stuff on it. It looks horrendous, I know. But this started life as a model aircraft doping brush, and the brushes were about that long originally. Airbrushing is a branch of the hobby that I started to take interest in about 1980. The best airbrushes that I've ever used, and I'm pleased to show you, are the Iwata airbrushes. And this is the Iwata Eclipse SBS. Now this is a particularly good airbrush. It can be used for large coverage, big areas, as well as painting very, very tiny details. It really is a superb model. That's the one that I use most of the time. As I mentioned earlier, I choose to use different types of paint because of their varying characteristics. I found that both Model Air and Life Colour are very good paints. I find that the life colour gives a nice, extremely matte finish. So what I'll do is use the life colour to do the base colour, and then I'll add a secondary shading colour using the Model Air, because the Model Air has a much better capability being thinned, and I'll be able to actually lay a nice subtle shading over the top of the life colour base. Going by the box illustration, I'm going to initially use a field grey colour, which is part of a series of uniform colours. So I'm just going to shake that up. It looks like it's quite well mixed. Prime the airbrush with tap water. You can use a distilled water or something like that, but I find that the tap water is perfectly okay. So I'm just going to make sure that the airbrush is clean. Now I've just got a tiny drop of water in the bottom of the bowl, and I'm going to pour some colour in, and again just stir that. Now this particular colour is probably 2 or 3 shades lighter than the desired colour that I want at the end of it. If you start with a lighter colour, then you can shade to a darker colour, and rather than highlight and shade, this colour, as it's lighter, will act as the highlight colour. So in actual fact, you're just using this almost like another form of primer. You probably just heard that sound, which is the compressor cutting in. It constantly keeps to a standard pressure. Generally I work at about 25 psi, which is a bit more than some people like to use. It's all down to personal taste. Because of the undercuts and the way the trousers of the figure disappear up underneath the smock, I need to spray the grey colour right into all the extremities. This will partially act as a primer. This area will be shaded with a secondary colour. So we'll just start to put this in and get some coverage on the legs. At this stage, as it's the only colour, we don't need to worry about masking. But as you can see, because it's got a fairly good fine nozzle, the overspray can be kept to a minimum between the different colours. So you can more or less paint just the trouser area without encroaching onto the jump smock or any adjacent areas. So while I'm doing this, I'm constantly aware that if I'm putting too much paint on and it's a bit too damp, or any chance that it might run, the old hairdryer is underneath my bench, which I'll take out and just dry off this coat so that I can build up another coat. Under certain lights you can see the way shadows will fall on creases. This helps to choose when accentuating these with paint. Some people choose a natural single light source, i.e. from the top left or top right of a figure. I tend to just shade from all directions just to accentuate the depth of the figure from the outside inwards, rather than thinking of a hypothetical light source. And the reasoning behind this is that I believe that if you imagine there's a light source from a certain direction, if the figure's placed in a natural light situation where it's got a conflicting light, this illusion's instantly shattered. So I tend to just shade with the idea that the highest spots are lighter and darker areas are darker. But it's really a matter of choice and down to your eye and how you interpret light and shade. Using German green, it's actually a bit like a field grey colour. Start to add some shading. I'm going to start up in the deepest recesses. It'd probably be difficult to see this. It's a good idea to shade a little bit darker up where the smock overhangs the trousers, just to give an idea of depth. Everybody looks at things in a different way, and the thing is, the creases can be airbrushed according to your taste. Just going to add some black to the grey mix so I'll get a much better contrast with the shading. Going up in the crutch area, the spray where the smock overhangs. Just to emphasise a bit of depth there. See, that gives it a much better contrast than the previous colour. But it's better just to be a bit on the safe side when you begin to add shading colours. You don't want it to go instantly to the darkest shade before you try using a subtle changing tone. Now that I've done the trousers, my attention turns to the camouflage as shown on the box art, which shows tan water camouflage, and I have a reference of this in a Histoire Collections book. Although it's not the same smock as used on the Fallschirmjäger, it's pretty much the same type of camouflage as seen, and this is shown here in quite good detail. So going by this reference, it's very much like some of the German armoured fighting vehicles of that period. There's a three-colour camouflage. There's a base colour which looks like a dark yellow. So we're looking at a base colour, and I've looked at my various colours, and the life colour tropical tan is quite a good match for the illustration at the top of the page here. What I'll do now is mask the trouser area in order to put a base colour on which to add the secondary camouflage colours. So what we want to do is to follow the line of the trousers around each leg as neatly as possible. The look of it doesn't matter too much as long as that very top leading edge where the two colours join is relatively neat. So once you've got the top part like that, just to be doubly sure, just mask generally over the rest. It may look untidy, but as long as everything is sealed up to the edges, that's all you need it to do. It doesn't look pretty, but it'll do the job. At this stage, I think it's a good point to have a look at a genuine camouflage garment and look at some of the pitfalls and things that you have to deal with when actually painting a scale camouflage effect. This is an original 1942 pattern Denison smock, and as worn by the Paras in the invasion. As you can see, that there are actually only three colours involved in this camouflage, and it's interesting to note that although there are only three colours, there are variations where each colour overlaps, which make other colours, which compounds the effect of the camouflage. Right, so we'll just check that's coming out fine. So I just dust this on to begin with. Give a light dust coat all over. Now I'll just tilt this up, and it's a good idea just to start by spraying up underneath all the undercuts. Certain directions you won't get good coverage into the nooks and crannies, so if you hold the figure and spray upwards, I normally do that first, try and get it up underneath first. You can't see when the figure's standing level. It'll need another good coat after this, but we're getting into all the little bits and pieces. Now I'm really going over giving a secondary coat. This is the base colour of the camouflage, which is a characteristic of this particular style of camouflage. You have to work around this way really, because the material on the full size original probably would have been printed in the lightest colour first. At this stage there's no idea of if there's any seepage underneath the masking, but there's no need to panic, because more of the original grey can be put in the airbrush, and that can be touched in either with the airbrush or with a brush. So at this stage there's absolutely no need to worry. Basic colours dried, so now we set about seeing how well the masking has worked. Sometimes you're quite lucky, it'll just come off almost as a one piece. Tweezers and a scalpel are handy to do this, but I think most of it's going to come off just with the tweezers. We don't want any scratches on the nice matte finish. Might need a little bit of touching in here and there with a brush, but that way you've got two base colours. Just going to run some paint round the edge of the smock where it joins where the trousers were masked off. This will just make it a little bit more obvious of what's the smock and what's the trousers. Do what we can to make it less obvious that it's all one solid piece of resin. It's only really at this stage that you can shade the lightest colour with any effect. What we're doing is shading the recessed areas. Most of this side I've added more detail with the shading, and the other side here there's less of it, which gives a contrast of the difference it makes. A lot of this will be covered up later by the other colours of the camouflage. You can just build up very light light overspraying of the base colour. It's almost translucent. So we've got to a stage now where I've added a secondary colour to the base colour of the jump smock. Now it remains to add the secondary and third colour, the red, brown and the green. Now on close examination of the pictures there are jagged edge shapes, a bit similar to the splinter camouflage. What I'll do now is add some red, brown and green areas to make this a three-tone camouflage. Obviously colours vary quite considerably from uniform to uniform. It's something that's been debated for years. I think the colour most suited would be this field green. I'd like to use Vallejo for this colour to go over the top because you can atomise it through the airbrush nozzle. Just going to do a random area. To reproduce the idea that there are basic shapes underneath this camouflage, what I've done is cut some zigzag shapes, and what I'm going to reproduce is the hint that there's core shapes to the camouflage. It's a soft edge camouflage, but there are basically shapes involved in this as well. But you can only just about see those, so what I'm going to do is just fog in the core of the shapes. It's not an easy thing to reproduce. As you can see, I'm getting the random shapes on. Just give a more of a feel of the full-size camouflage. In actual fact, these shapes are quite hard to make out. They need to be slightly blended. So now we've got to a stage where we've done the green. It's time to add some red brown to the camouflage, and again I'm doing the same thing with this as I did with the green. Beginning to look more like the camouflage we want it to look like. The thing is to repeatedly look at the the pictures of the original and try to make a good job of balancing the colours. So we're doing a subtle addition of these shapes again, just to give an idea that these are overprinted shapes on the material. Draw some parallel lines. Cut some small slots in the masking tape. So what we've got now is a basic mask which we can overlay onto the figure and hopefully recreate the characteristic rain pattern. Spray through our mask and gently lift it off. Then we've got some rain marks there. And then move it across a little bit. Again, smooth it down. And again, move it off. So we're gradually building up what would normally be a bit of a tedious thing to do. Just this is a more finished version that I have now, with a lot of extra work that's been done. I've actually readjusted some of the balance of the colours because I found that they were a little bit on the bright side, and also, like with AFVs, it's difficult to get an even balance of the colours on a given area, i.e. there could be too much red brown or too much green or too much of the dark yellow. I've actually continued the rain pattern using a brush to get particularly difficult areas it's difficult to mask, so the whole thing has been given the rain effect. I've just lined in all the pockets and details just to accentuate the lines of the garment, just to show the shape of it. I'm going to shade underneath this pocket to make it look as though it's deeper. It's a good idea just to rotate it until you're happy with an angle that you can get the brush in. Just going to brush some water in there because I just want that to soften that edge. Again, it's a matter of personal choice, really. It's how you see something. Everybody sees things in a different way. In fact, I might approach the figure differently one day than another, purely because of the light, or interpretation from one day to the next might be different. Now, as this material is puckered and isn't perfectly smooth, I'm just going to put some little lines in just to emphasize that it's not perfectly smooth. As you look around the figure, you can see certain areas need a bit more emphasis than others. I've noticed there's a pocket here which there's a seam needs to be lined in. Again, don't worry too much if you go over or make the line too thick, because you can go back over and adjust this. Obviously that's within reason, because there's areas that are airbrushed with a subtle graduation in tone, so you can't always get away with brushing directly over the top of something. Also, I'm just going to use quite a dark border around where the Luftwaffe eagle is. Although this is an SS Fallschirmjäger, they used the equipment from the Luftwaffe. The really obvious scene that I've not done anything with is on this shoulder. So to some degree this bordering is also in effect a shading technique. More subtle shading can be done with the airbrush, and this is really the kind of more obvious exact shading. This is really revisiting all the places that the sculptor has lovingly produced with his skills with his sculpting. Just makes everything much more apparent and clear. Now there's a small flap here, and it doesn't really look very interesting at this stage, but I'm hoping by using the techniques that I've just shown that we'll make that more of a feature, and hopefully you'll see the idea of this technique and what I've been doing with the rest of the figure. So as you can see, it's just a blob of camouflage really, but because it is a feature of the garment, I'm going to try and bring that out a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to border it with the darker colour. I'm going to do underneath. So already this looks more interesting because it's bordered. Now I'm going to go on to highlighting areas such as this, so it makes that a lot more interesting and actually gives you that shape rather than it looking bland and mixing in with the rest of it. Right, so I've mixed up some lighter version of the dark yellow colour. I've just added a drop of white and a slight drop of yellow to it, just to make a marginally lighter version of the dark yellow, and just going to emphasise the edge of this flap so that it actually enhances the shape and you can actually see it rather than it just blending in. I'm just going to run a series of tiny touches along that edge, really to give an idea of wear and a highlight. It can look like wear and tear as well as being a convenient highlight, and then you can just blend that in with a drop of water just to soften it. You can see now that you've actually got the shape shows up, whereas before it didn't. A little added interest rather than it being all one bland shape. This is my prized possession, my Iwata Micron Model B. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use it for doing some shading over the top of the camouflage. It's going to be relatively subtle. I'm going to use a neutral tone over all three colours, so I'm not actually shading individual colours, I'm shading the whole combinations of the three colours. I've mixed up some burnt sienna and some black in a very, very thin mixture of the Vallejo Model Air burnt umber and black, and also added to this, rather than thinning with water, I've used unusually their airbrush cleaner. It's not usually what you would use, but I actually find that this atomises through the nozzles really nicely. I prefer it to using any other thinning medium. So right at the bottom here, I'm just going to put a slight one in the red brown here. Again, subtlety is the name of the game. It's probably very difficult to even see it, but it is there. This one's probably a little more obvious. I have to be careful not to go too mad and obliterate all of the detail, all those painted lines. But there are certain creases that would benefit from a little bit of emphasis. Where the grenade goes, that'll be a natural place to add shading. Now, because a lot of these creases are running the other way, I think it'll be a natural thing to move it on the horizontal, so it's easier to go into the creases. Trying to get it darker, where it just appears underneath the belt, and then just let it fade out. The further down the crease it gets, and the shallower the crease gets, it just fades out. As you can see, the Micron B is very controllable at this sort of distance, and you can actually control it very, very accurately. So as you can see, it's gradually getting more and more subtle. Even some of the areas that have previously been shaded using other techniques can be revisited again and given a little bit more depth, and the whole thing becomes even more subtle and interesting. I'm just going to paint the basic flat areas of the webbing, which is leather. I'm going to paint them in matte black, and afterwards that will be toned down with burnt umber and other colours to give it a little bit of texture and add a bit of interest here and there. It's not really necessary to mask an area like this. The ammunition pouches will cover most of this area anyway, but I've found that it's wise just to paint it as neatly as you can anyway, because even if you take it for granted that it's going to be covered with something else, there's always the chance that something might spoil the effect. It's worth making a mental note if there are any bits that you think might need to be retouched. Best way to do these sort of areas is to paint the outside line first and then fill it in afterwards. I'm filling in that loop because that can actually give quite a nice backdrop to emphasise that D-ring when it's painted on, rather than having a light background. If it's black, it will actually throw out the shape a lot better. So I've got to the stage now, I've got the base colour for the Y straps on, which are leather. The colour I've used has got a slight sheen on it, which is quite nice for the effect that I want. At the same time that I've done this, I'll put a base coat on the boots, a mixture of black and burnt umber again. That will be a nice colour to work from. I don't want to go straight to jet black because I think a little bit of artist's license can actually improve the look of leather. But I think in this case I should probably use variations on a very dark brown black mix. I take care to get the top edge in first, and then anything below that is dead easy. It will just flow. Again, there's no need to mask these for airbrushing. I might add some highlights with lighter shades with the airbrush later, but that still won't require any form of masking, just careful aiming of the airbrush. I've got the basic leather colour already done on the Y straps and the boots. I've already painted the pouches in the same colour. What I need to do now is to slightly distress them and make them look a little bit more worn and more realistic. So to that end, what I've got is some Vallejo sandy brown, and what I'm going to do is dry brush, which means that you get an old brush and cut it off to a square top. The idea is to get that very, very tacky and dry. So a bit of old cardboard is an ideal thing, just to rotate the head of the brush so practically nothing's coming off of it. Now the idea is to make light passes over the top of the item, and it should start to pick up round the edges, and you should have slight distressed edges as leather gets scuffed and used, so the black surface gets damaged. So you really want to concentrate on the edges that would be scuffed and worn. Hopefully you can see there's the difference between a treated and untreated pouch. Right, we've got all the pouches painted and ready to go on the figure. So we're quite fortunate that the keys and everything are quite obvious where the pieces actually mount to. So put in some cyanoacrylate glue and then just wiggle that into position. And that's the first lot. Now the others are actually individually designed to fit in their allotted spaces, which is got the two circles to finish things off. And rather than looking perfectly lined up, they look quite natural because they're a little bit up and down and not perfectly straight, which is good. We now come on to a really important part of the figure. It's a make or break part of any figure, flesh tone. Now really a lot of what's involved with producing a realistic flesh tone is really looking at pictures, looking at people, inner word observation really. It's not always easy to get an idea of natural flesh tones by looking at printed things, because there are unnatural colours made from a 4-colour process. I tend to mix my own flesh tones from colours that I've become used to over a period of time. One of the colours that I've found that's invaluable for mixing a flesh tone is sandy brown, which is a model air colour, and it seems unusual to use a sandy brown, but is actually a very good base flesh tone colour. Other colours that are good for mixing flesh tones are also burnt umber and burnt sienna. Mixed with white can make a very good flesh tone. The head and the hands, all being flesh tone, have been base coated with a light to medium tone of a mixture of sandy brown and white, which gives this light flesh tone. I'll work over the top of this basic light flesh tone with progressively darker tones of the same colour, and eventually maybe some burnt umber to give some depth to the shadows, such as the extreme shadows underneath the jawline. I'm going to look at all of the natural or naturally shaded areas of the face and head and hopefully exaggerate or accentuate those using colour. These are areas such as under the cheekbones and underneath the jawline and above and below the eyes. This is really just going to be a light build up just to get an idea of how the face will look. So I'm just building the colour up underneath the jawline there. So at this stage, I don't know where you can see, there's just a little bit of colour building up there. So we're really purely relying on the base flesh tone for the highlights. You're working from light to dark, and what appears light to begin with will be the highlighted colour. For the highlights, I'm going to use Createx, which is an airbrush paint, and this is actually a pre-mixed flesh tone colour. It's a very pale colour. It's got a slightly more pinkish tinge to it, and I think over the top of colour I've already used, it'll actually take away a little bit of the yellowish tone, which is more of a tan sort of look. Right, so I'm going to use this colour on the highlights, which are the forehead, the bridge of the nose and the nostrils, the top of the cheeks, the to highlight cheekbones, the chin and the either side of the top lip. The jawbone is also another. As I'm just doing this highlight here, it leaves the crease there still shaded. That's the good thing about this particular airbrush, you can actually target very small areas indeed. So we've got the other colour over the top now, which is making it look a little bit more interesting. It's highlighted the flesh tone, but I will go back to use another darker shade. Right, so now I've done the highlights, I'm actually going to go back again and do some shading to darken some of the shading, to give a little bit more contrast. Just going to exaggerate the cheekbones a little bit more. Right, so we've got the overall skin tone quite nicely there now, so that's pretty much ready to detail the eyes and the rest of the face. Right, now we've got to this stage, the brush will take over where the airbrush is it's not totally finished, but for the flesh tone it's kind of 95% finished. We're going to start doing the eyes. Now I usually find that by putting the whites of the eyes in first, usually the best way for me. So I'm going to use naturally enough white, but I'm not actually going to use pure white. I'm going to add some, in this case the sandy brown, which is the same flesh colour, just to take the starkness of the white down so that it looks more of an off-white. It's a little bit lighter than the lightest flesh tone colour. So this comes at the point where you need to make sure that you've got a firm base to paint, and then using the tip of the brush just take it to one side just gently let it go into the area. I find it quite interesting to look at pictures and to look at people and see how the direction of eyes and the position of the head and everything can be taken into consideration to create drama or a certain sort of expression or whatever. With this particular figure, he'll be looking slightly to his left. They're not going to be perfectly centered, but slightly to the left. So I'm just going to put the second base colour in for the pupil. So we've got the whites of the eyes in and the outside of the pupil colour. I'm now going to paint the actual inside colour of the eye, leaving an outside ring of the dark colour. But basically we're just looking at concentric circles for the eye. When the eyes are centred in facing forward, that you don't really see very much white of anybody's eyes, and that can look really unnatural and almost like a cat or something. So here we have the eyes positioned ready for the iris to be added in black. Just practice loading the brush and using the tip, because really you're acting on the paint to form into a nice circular droplet as it goes onto the eye. The thing is to make sure that your hand is firm and settled on the table first for this. Use your other fingers as a rest, and then it's just a question of trying to get the brush in as close as possible. It's great if you can get one in, and if you can get two in and they match, then it's even better. It doesn't always happen that way, but let's see what we can do. You can go back to the other one, make it slightly bigger. If one's slightly bigger than the other, you can go from one to the other to make them match as best you can. I'm quite happy that they're quite a good match. What I use is Vallejo gloss varnish. It's got a bluish tinge to it when it's still wet, but it dries to a really nice deep shine. Once this is floated onto the eyes, it really picks up the reflection nicely and they almost look like tiny glass eyes. One final detail that needs to be added to the corner of the eye is the tiny pinkish coloured dot in the corner of the eye where the tear duct would be. As I've done him with brown eyes, I think his hair is going to be dark brown, so I think that'll make a good contrast. I'm just going to paint individual tiny lines where his moulded eyebrows are indicated, rather than just blocked in as one big mass. You can get a much better effect going down to almost as if there's the odd tiny hair. And where it thickens, you just build up several small lines. Now the hair, again, that's something that it's not a good idea just to blob it in one big lump. By using the tip of the brush, you can actually get the shapes of the individual clumps of hair nicely, and it actually looks quite convincing rather than just looking like a massive blob. By taking care just to do individual strands of hair, it can really pay dividends. This is actually thinned to the point where it's going on as one layer, and it's actually shading itself. The base flesh colour is acting like a nice background for the burnt umber, and in the moulded detail it's actually going darker. Now I'm just going to put another coat clear gloss on the eyes just to give an extra bit of gloss. Right, I'm going to add another little detail now, which is the stubble on his chin. Seems strange, but I actually used blue for that, added to the colour that I used earlier for the highlights. I'm just going to add a tiny drop of black to that and drop more blue. I'm going to mix a very, very thin mixture of this. It's a very subtle effect. Just do it along the jawline and a little bit on the top lip. That's the stubble effect. The final job to do on the face is to just add a little drop of red to the cheeks. In fact, I'm going to use some orange and a little drop of red mixed together. What I'll actually be applying is a very, very fine, subtle spray of this. You don't really want too much at all. So, literally just a hint of it on the cheeks. On the bridge of the nose. And that's it. It's time to put his head on. Let's see the crowning glory, hopefully, and let's see how that goes. Obviously we test fitted it and it should all go on quite nicely. And there we have it.
Well, it's always a pleasure to watch an expert at work. So, please join me again soon for another program in the series of Expert Modelcraft. And don't forget the DVD extras.
Despite being a very nicely produced model, there are a couple of items which aren't included, which need to be made from scratch to finish the model to the level as seen on the box art. The main conspicuous absence is the helmet strap and harness, which is quite recognisable on Paratrooper's helmet. This can be made with lead foil or plastic strip, but my preference in this scale is to use genuine leather. I have here a piece of leather which is a really useful source of straps and for pieces of equipment. I use it for both models and some of the 1/6 action figures, which I sometimes modify. I obtained it from a doll's hospital, in fact, which is an unusual source, but it's surprising the different materials that can be obtained from unlikely sources. This piece is a particularly fine piece with a lovely natural texture, which is a nice fine grain. It actually varies from one end to the other. At this end it's got a lovely fine scale texture. It's not very thick and it's ideal scale material. What better than the real leather to reproduce a leather in a much smaller scale? The only problem I've found is cutting this thin material. Because it's flexible, it's quite a difficult medium to cut. So with this in mind, I've actually found a way of doing it which cuts it accurately and without irregularities. Place the leather flat and then get some masking tape and put that on the reverse, and that just stiffens the leather, which makes cutting a lot easier. Using a very sharp knife, just gently cut strips. Now, because of the masking tape backing, you'll find that this cuts very accurately and very neatly. Once a suitable strip is cut, the masking tape can simply be removed and discarded. It's quite a flexible material. You can stretch the leather and it'll become slightly thinner in width. That gives an idea of the sort of thing, if you can imagine the helmet on the top. What we're going to attempt to do is to make a buckle just by bending the wire and keeping it all in one piece. Now this that we're bending now will be the top edge of the buckle. Basically what we're looking at is this buckle shape, just bent in one piece. So it's quite handy because you can actually thread the leather through that if you need to without it falling apart. This can be put on a flat surface and then gently but accurately cut there and flattened. Now the gaps here and here can be filled with super glue. It could be painted if necessary, but as I'll just demonstrate, it will actually operate as a miniature buckle. But a bit of experimentation with size and proportion will end up with something that's quite acceptable. And as nothing's supplied with the kit, and it's something that is essential, it's nice to be able to complete it with this. Right, so once the buckle's made and the leather's cut, it's simply a matter of trial and error, putting the helmet on the figure's head and cutting the leather straps, preferably slightly longer than you would need them to be, and then adjusting and fine-tuning, put everything together to make a miniature harness like this. I've added the adjustment loops here, again leather strips cut and wound round and glued, just for the purpose of test fitting. I'll just tuck this up underneath. This can be glued at a later stage. The rear straps have been cut with probably a little bit less than a 45-degree angle, so that joins onto the strap here, and there you have the completed harness. Once the primer has been applied, sometimes the fitter parts might be changed, so it's a good idea just to check that everything fits as it should do. Every figure moulded in silicone rubber mould can vary, so it's a good idea just to check whether the rifle will fit into the palm of the hand, and it can be just plugged in just to see what it will look like. It'll give you a bit of a preview to how the final figure will look. So now you know how everything fits together. Things such as the stick grenade can be offered up, and there are a few other items which we need to produce at this stage before we actually start painting. We need to make a rifle sling for the KR98 rifle and some grenade loops. The egg grenades were often attached to the KR98 pouches via their straps, which were just popper studded over. These can be reproduced quite easily and effectively by winding wire around a former, such as a shank of a drill or a piece of rod. Then this can be slipped off the end of the shaft and then placed level on the cutting surface, and with a scalpel, a firm push, needs quite a bit of pressure, to give the illusion that the loops from the grenades are actually threaded through the straps of the KR98 pouches. Just cut a nick out so you have a U-shaped section. So this can then be glued onto there. I'm just going to apply a tiny drop of this cyanoacrylate glue and float it in between where the ring attaches to the pouch. I've still got some metal fastenings on the jump smock which need to be bordered with a mixture of burnt umber and black. What I should do is actually paint these studs totally using this dark mixture, and this will act as a good background for painting the metal colour over the top. Painting them first in a dark colour, it's actually in effect like outlining and detailing each stud, but without the difficulty of actually painting the inside and outside detail, because there's a ring within a ring. You can see now that painting these popper studs first with a dark colour is a good way of accentuating the shape. So you've got a shadow in the middle and around the outside all in one step, rather than painting them silver and then painting a black dot in the centre and painting a neat line around the outside. It's just done it in one hit straight away. And it's pretty much the same technique as dry brushing. It is like a controlled dry brushing, but possibly a little bit neater. Now the runes, the SS runes on the collar, as they're embroidered, what I'll do is put a base colour of gunmetal on first. I'm doing lines like this because they were embroidered with thread, so I'll just do that as a base colour. At the same time I'm doing this, I'm going to paint the roll neck jumper, which is a dark grey colour. Not forgetting the inside where it disappears to meet the neck. There are a lot of details to think of at this stage. What I'm going to do is to paint the belt buckle in a black mixed with a little bit of the silver, and then I shall use a combination of dry brushing and brushwork to bring out the details of the eagle. And just drag it lightly, just dust it very lightly over the top. I'm just going to dry brush the boots with a mixture of sandy brown and burnt umber to bring out most of the details of the laces, some of the other highlights. Just needs a light passes over, so you can see most of the laces seem to appear as if by magic. Tiny drop of silver and some white to make a metallic grey colour. It will give you an impression of an embroidered SS rune. And I'm going to use a white and black and make a medium sort of grey. So with a combination of the moulded detail and careful brushwork, it should look quite like an embroidered Luftwaffe eagle. So I'm going to use some white and a little drop of brown just to make it an off-white. And there's some stitching to add on the equipment on the various straps. Actually just dry brushing over the top to leave the moulded stitching where it was designed to be. It's not really any panic if you go over the edge onto the uniform. That can be touched in afterwards. In fact, I have gone over a little bit on the red brown just here. That can just be softened up with some water if necessary. Can be brushed in afterwards. There's a prime example of what I was saying about going over the edge on the shoulder there. I shall take that into consideration and go back to that later and tidy that up if necessary, either by cleaning it up with a tiny drop of thinner or actually mixing some of the colour required to disguise it. This sort of brush is ideal for this type of work. You can get a nice load of paint on it and not have to keep reloading it. Gone a little bit heavy-handed there, so I'm going to wipe the paint off the brush and then just paint it back. There's never any need to panic, because there's nothing that can't be gone back over and put right. Once that's dry, it'll be worth having another look just to check that that's okay. But at this stage it looks quite reasonable. It doesn't matter if you go over the eyelid, because that'll be painted and highlighted again. I've actually gone over the lower lid a little bit, but you can actually get rid of most of that with water. A tiny drop of thinner if necessary. Not the airbrush, the Media airbrush cleaner is a little less aggressive than the Vallejo one for this job. I first became aware of models. My older brother, who's about 4.5 years older than me, had a display cabinet, which is a cabinet I still have some of my models in now. He actually had probably 20 or 30 Airfix, Revell, Frog aircraft models, which he used to sort of detail with the undercarriage. He used to paint the wheels matte black, things like the Mae West and the figures' faces and that type of thing, but generally they were just built from the box and displayed with the decals and everything all in place. Yeah, obviously as I was the younger brother, my older brother didn't really like me anywhere near the models because of their fragile nature. But as I got older, obviously I was curious to have a go myself. My brother used to make models for me. I used to have, I think my first kit was possibly the Airfix Westland Wessex helicopter. No, Whirlwind, sorry, Westland Whirlwind helicopter. And then an Arado float plane, German float plane, which my brother built for me. One of my earliest recollections is having those built, and also in about must have been the early to mid 60s, the James Bond Little Nelly auto gyro kit was another thing that my brother bought as a present and then built for me. So he obviously had the enjoyment of building it, and the little brother had it to keep and to play with. That were some of my earliest memories of models. As I got more and more interested, I'd have my own sets of figures, and I used to play with the 1/32 scale, the larger polythene figures that Airfix did, with the strong point building, which had sandbags, and it was basically a war-wrecked building scenario that went with the figures. And I started getting interested in painting the flesh tones and a little bit of camouflage and a few details on those. And then it must have been leading up to the early 70s, I started looking at the collector's series from Airfix. The first figure that figure kit as such that I can remember consciously having was a 10th Hussar, Napoleonic British 10th Hussar figure from Airfix. And Woolworths used to supply, used to be able to buy sets of paints which were in small glass jars, usually red, yellow, blue, yellow and black. Red, yellow, blue, white and black. And on the back of the packet there was usually an instruction chart of how to mix other colours from those basic colours, which really set me up in the art of mixing colours. In the early days of my airbrushing activities, I didn't really know what to expect, and I was very much self-taught. Air pressures, thinning the paint to the right degree were all unknown factors, and I didn't really have anyone to confer with. Most of the people that were concerned with airbrushing didn't really do modelling with one. They were mainly sort of people that were using them for artwork, so the mediums were totally different than the sort of things that I was using. I started off with air cans, and that got very expensive and also frustrating, particularly when you're halfway through a job and they ran out. So again, I was lucky. Another employee of the same company that I was working at had a second-hand compressor, which again I think was about £5 or £10, which was next to nothing sort of nowadays. And so I was well and truly set up with a good, reasonable airbrush setup. While I was a junior, I was encouraged to go to the British Model Soul Society national competitions, and it was a bit awe-inspiring going to a national competition at that sort of age, at probably about 16, to see how I'd get on. And I actually managed to get a third in one of the competitions the first year I went, so that was very encouraging at that stage, and you know, it was very nice. A big step for me came in 1990 when I started painting figures for Hysterex agents for their promotional use and for their display cabinets. I visited Lynn Sangster at his Dover address, Castle Street, and Lynn wanted to buy a figure from me that I just painted, but because I simply wasn't used to having figures sort of bought from me, I really didn't know what to do. So Lynn actually supplied me with, I think it was about 3 figures to paint for him. He commissioned me to paint them specially. I didn't realise at that time what doing those initial 3 figures would lead to. I ended up painting 3 figures of probably in the hundreds of figures of the 120mm range, which I thoroughly enjoyed over a period of quite a few years. And the Verlinden range, as it expanded, I painted everything from Romans to Gulf War current type figures. So Lynn ended up with a cabinet full of interesting figures, and it also helped me out from a bad time when I was unemployed. Lynn approached me via Ken Jones to write an article on one of the Verlinden vehicles, the Universal Carrier, which I'd never done an article for a magazine, yet alone sort of my favourite, which is military modelling. So I was thrilled to do it, armed with little more than an O-level in English language, and relying on my father and my brother to do the photographs. I managed to get my first article done for the magazine. I was very pleased with it, and it has led on to more and more articles since, and it's something that I really enjoy. Nowadays, with the invention of digital photography, it's revolutionised the article writing, because there's no throwaway reams of prints, and you can actually see what you're getting before you advance to the next stage of the article. It's great. You can do so much more with it, and I've done more and more articles, and thoroughly enjoying it. Since 1990, I've done painting and airbrush demonstrations at Euromilitaire, which is an annual thing which I really enjoy. It's great because it's fairly low key, non-structured, fairly informal affair, more of a clinic really, where people can ask me any questions if they have any problems using their airbrush or compressor or whatever. Despite being involved with the hobby for over 30 years, I still find that there are new models, new horizons, new techniques. I'm always learning things from other people, and the hobby never fails to excite me. I think it's a fantastic hobby. In recent years, it never ceases to amaze me, the advancement of the hobby and the quality of people's work, the painting, and just the sheer imagination that people put into the hobby. Also, a lot of people are more aware of historical accuracy and doing more research, which is something I, in the past, haven't really paid much attention to. It never ceases to amaze me how in recent times the hobby's advanced, from the early days of the of Airfix sort of multi-pose figures and that type of thing to what's available now is quite amazing, and people's work has improved, painting and just the sheer imagination that goes into people's work. It's inspiring really. It just makes you wonder sort of where it'll all lead to really. The new developments all the time. From my own point of view, from both circumstances and sort of just the fact that I enjoy different mediums, I've actually got more and more into action figures, and despite liking conventional modelling, I've actually turned my attention quite recently into the 1/6 scale side of things. Although these aren't models in the conventional sense of the word, like plastic kits or whatever, the dragon action figures, for example, are extremely well researched, and over a period of about 6 or 7 years or so, they've advanced to greater and greater levels of detail. I like to take a basic figure and improve details of the weapons and all the hard items of equipment, and the moulded items can be improved pretty much the same as plastic model kits can be. Each of the heads have got their own character, and like this one, it's been repainted. It's got a much more realistic air than it would have had straight from the box. It's difficult to know where this will lead. I still won't give up my conventional painting, but I find this very enjoyable, down to the fact that miniature boots made of leather and other bits and pieces are available in this scale. This particular side of the hobby is expanding constantly. So in the future I should still be doing quite a lot of 1/6 figures. But in recent years I've done a lot more vehicles than I've done figures. I enjoy the vehicle side of things. There's a lot of scope to weather. Although I'm optimistic that with the Micron B, the Iwata Micron B airbrush, with its precise spray pattern, I can turn my techniques more towards the large scale figure side of things. I enjoy using the airbrush, particularly on the larger figures, but with the airbrushes that I have now, I can probably use them more on smaller scales. So in the future I'm hoping to get to grips more with perfecting techniques on figures, because I think there is a lot of room to improve on the techniques. Perhaps try and develop other techniques that I haven't used yet. But I've actually used the Eclipse model on a 1/32 scale, 54mm scale figure for highlighting and shading. I intend to do this a lot more, and just try and improve techniques and advance as much as I can with new ideas. It's always interesting to see what new frontiers the hobby will offer up.
Once you've chosen a military figure to build and paint, quite often you won't be happy until you get the details absolutely correct. Colours and details of uniforms are quite an important thing. In fact, the most important thing of all, really, to get everything correct and true to the original. A very good way, obviously, are books. I've got a selection of books here, which obviously, if you can get the older material from the period you're working from, it's a good thing. For instance, I've got a 1942 small arms manual here, which although it's probably not very particularly full of illustrations, it gives you a sense of how things work and their operation, which can help when posing and displaying model figures. In fact, some manufacturers even manufacture figures incorrectly holding weapons, and this kind of reference can alleviate that sort of problem. It's very, very useful. A period 1940s piece of literature. In fact, it's even interesting that it's got adverts and illustrations, which can also help if you're building a diorama to get an idea of graphics and that sort of thing that you might possibly want to use, maybe posters on walls and that sort of thing. But a very useful book. I have along the same lines some old infantry training manuals which have details on how various weapons are used in combat and handling and that sort of thing. I found over the years a very good source of fairly instant and recognisable reference, a book such as the Osprey Men at Arms series, which cover a variety of periods right from ancient times to present day. These have very nice colour illustrations which generally are quite nicely produced. I particularly like the Ron Volstad ones, which really give a nice flavour of the period and the colouring and everything. I always find those quite an exciting reference to use, as well as the illustrated books, which are very nice. In more recent years, there's been a trend to produce books which have people actually dressed in period equipment, such as the Histoire and Collection range, which is superb, and like this, which is illustrated with front and back views. In recent times, the trend has been towards using models, people dressed in period equipment, which gives a much better feeling of the period and the way the equipment hangs on real people. Whilst illustrations are very nice, there's nothing better than actually seeing people dressed in the correct equipment, posed up. They look very much like they would have done in the original campaigns. These books mainly are the Histoire collection. French books are very good from this regard. They go into great detail about all the equipment. Very nicely illustrated, down to, as you can see on this page, boots, even down to boot polish and other equipment used that wouldn't necessarily be required normally. Are great in dioramas for adding extra detail. It also gives you an idea of insignia and in quite good detail as well. Most of these living history books are based on the Second World War, but there are other titles available which also illustrate different periods of history, such as the later Vietnam War here, the Windrow and Green book, and an American Civil War one, which is quite useful. It's got a lot of interesting pictures of people posed in the period equipment, which is ideal for getting reference.